So, picture this. It's 1960. A college sophomore is attending this really polite, highly esteemed finishing school for Black women down in Atlanta.
Right. A very insulated place.
Exactly. And she just walks off her secluded campus and she sits down in the front of a segregated city bus. I mean, she didn't have a weapon, she didn't have a megaphone or anything like that.
Just putting her body on the line.
Yeah, and a white man approaches her, pulls out a knife, and literally holds it to her. And she didn't scream, she didn't run, she didn't even move, you know?
Oh.
She simply sat there just staring him down in absolute silence until the bus finally reached her stop. I mean, we like to think that our fundamental rights come from, like, men in powdered wigs signing parchment in Philadelphia.
Or enlightened judges banging a gavel somewhere.
Right. But if you look closely at the actual mechanics of history, those rights were really secured by teenagers staring down knives on city buses. Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
Glad to be here for this one.
So normally, when we are taught history, we're presented with this expectation of neatness, right? It's presented like an architect's blueprint.
Oh, absolutely. Like it's all perfectly planned out from the top.
Exactly. Like a wise group of leaders drafts a constitution, a benevolent president signs some landmark piece of legislation, a Supreme Court issues a ruling, and suddenly society is just fundamentally changed for the better.
It's a very clean, orderly narrative.
Yeah.
And honestly, an incredibly comforting one.
It really is. We are basically taught that progress is delivered from above, just handed down to the masses by the institutions designed to protect us. But when you step into the actual chaotic landscape of social change, that blueprint just goes completely out the window.
Well, it is the absolute definition of a perception gap. I mean, the distance between what we think we know about how our rights are secured versus how they are actually won on the ground is just massive.
Right.
And that illusion, that democratic change, is simply this gift delivered from the top down by sacred documents and wise courts, is exactly what we are dismantling in this deep dive.
Yeah, so our mission today is to flip that traditional narrative completely upside down for you. To do this, we are looking through the lens of a collection of essays by the historian Howard Zinn.
From his book, Some Truths Are Not Self-Evident, right?
Yes, exactly. Zinn really spent his entire life investigating this primary hidden system of social change. He looks at the complex, honestly, often brutal relationship between formal rights written on paper, the sheer weight of institutional power, and the force of organized public pressure.
And his core argument is that formal guarantees, like the liberties laid out in the United States Constitution, only become meaningful when ordinary people organize and disrupt established routines.
They literally have to compel those massive institutions to act.
Right. But before we go any further, we really need to establish the analytical ground rules for you, the listener, as we unpack this material.
Yeah, this is important.
Howard Zinn is not writing from the perspective of some detached, neutral observer. He writes from an openly moral, highly activist perspective. He is deeply and fundamentally skeptical of concentrated state, military, and economic power.
Right, he definitely has a specific viewpoint.
So in this deep dive, we're going to impartially report on Zinn's politically charged content. And I should note, he takes aim with equal intensity at both left-wing and right-wing targets.
Yeah, nobody really escapes his critique.
Exactly. But we are not endorsing these viewpoints, nor are we taking sides on his historical judgments. Our goal here is simply to convey and thoroughly analyze the ideas, the documented historical examples, and the underlying arguments in his original source material.
Right, we just want to fully understand Zinn's mental model so we can use it to examine our own assumptions about how this all works.
Exactly.
So if we operate on Zinn's premise that rights aren't magically granted by the paper they're written on, where do they actually come from? Well, let's start with, the cornerstone of American civic religion, the illusion of the paper constitution.
Oh, yeah. He goes right for it in his essay, A People's Constitution.
Yeah. He argues that this document, which we practically revere as the ultimate infallible protector of our liberties, is conspicuously silent on some of the most vital issues of human existence.
Like economic justice, for instance.
Right. It doesn't guarantee economic justice. It says absolutely nothing about medical care. I mean, it took centuries to even mention sexual equality. But his more provocative claim is that the Constitution continually takes credit for historical achievements it didn't actually accomplish.
That's the part that really shifts your perspective. Zinn's assertion is that written rights almost always follow struggles that have already been fought and won outside of those formal institutions.
So the paper document doesn't create the right out of thin air.
Exactly. The paper merely records a victory that was won on the ground by people putting their livelihoods and often their physical bodies at risk. Take his analysis of slavery and the subsequent civil rights struggle.
Okay, let's look at that. Because if you read a standard history textbook, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are celebrated as these monumental achievements, right?
Right, the things that abolished slavery, guaranteed equal protection under the law, and secured the right to vote for Black Americans.
They are totally framed as the ultimate triumph of the constitutional system correcting itself.
But Zinn points out that these amendments merely codified what a massive, decades-long, incredibly dangerous anti-slavery movement had already forced into the public consciousness.
It is already happening.
Yes. And more immediately, they codified what the sheer military necessity of the Civil War had forced into reality. The Constitution was basically playing catch-up to the reality on the ground.
That makes a lot of sense.
And the really tragic proof of Zinn's thesis is what happened immediately after that ink dried. I mean, just having those sweeping guarantees of equality written into the Constitution meant absolutely nothing in practice.
A full century of nothing.
Literally a century of systemic disenfranchisement, forced segregation, and racial terror. Black Americans lived under Jim Crow apartheid, while the 14th and 15th Amendments were sitting right there in the Constitution, theoretically guaranteeing their equality.
While the institutions like the courts and the presidents and the Congress just completely ignored their own sacred document.
Completely ignored it. It wasn't until the grassroots movements of the 1950s and 60s, the grueling, highly coordinated boycotts, the sit-ins, the marches, that the government was finally forced to actually enforce the words that had been sitting dormant on paper for 100 years.
Think about what that means for how we view our everyday liberties, He applies the same logic to the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, which is something we all just totally take for granted.
Oh, absolutely. We just assume it's always there.
Right? You think, I live in America, the Constitution protects my right to speak my mind. But Zinn argues that when you step out of your house, the First Amendment is an illusion. When you are standing on a street corner handing out a flyer, what dictates your freedom of speech in that moment is not a Supreme Court ruling.
It's the local police officer standing right in front of you.
Exactly.
And it extends beyond the street corner into the fundamental realities of survival. Zinn asks us to look at the workplace. I mean, does the First Amendment protect your speech when you clock in on Monday morning?
Usually not.
For the vast majority of people, no. Your right to free expression is entirely dictated by your employer. They hold the power to fire you, strip you of your income, and revoke your access to health care if you say something they don't like.
It's terrifying when you frame it like that.
It is. And furthermore, the freedom of the press is functionally dictated by your financial access to the media to actually get your message heard.
Right. If you can't afford a printing press, what good is the freedom of the press?
Exactly. Zinn defines liberty not as a passive inheritance, but as an active physical reality. Liberties are taken by those courageous enough to risk going to jail or losing their jobs. They are not generously handed down by distant judges reading parchment.
I was actually trying to find a way to visualize this dynamic for you, the listener, and it makes me think of how we view the referee in a football game.
Oh, I like that. How so?
Well, we tend to look at the Constitution as the referee, right? The unquestionable authority that blows the whistle, enforces the rules fairly, and dictates the flow of the play.
Right, the impartial judge.
Exactly. But in Zinn's framework, the Constitution isn't the referee at all. It is merely the scoreboard. And the scoreboard doesn't sweat. It doesn't bleed. It doesn't call the plays or throw the blocks. It just sits there completely passive. It only records the points after they have been scored.
That is a perfect analogy.
You
Because
know,
it's the players on the field, the organized citizens putting their bodies on the line in the mud, who are doing the agonizing heavy lifting to actually change the score.
right. We stare at the scoreboard, expecting it to win the game for us. But the scoreboard has never won a game in its life.
So true. And if we accept that the Constitution merely records the outcome of the social struggle, then we are forced to look away from the politicians and the judges and look very closely at those players on the field.
Right. The people actually doing the work.
Zinn's work highlights specific, often marginalized groups who realized something profound very early on. They realized that playing by the polite, acceptable rules of society was getting them absolutely nowhere.
Because the system was designed to absorb polite requests and just file them away forever.
Exactly.
So if the scoreboard doesn't score the points and the politicians aren't driving the change, who is actually forcing the issue? we really have to look at the catalyst of disruption,
Huh.
because Zinn focuses heavily on the unpolite forces, the people who break the routine.
Like the Spelman students you mentioned earlier.
Yes. A prime, incredibly vivid example of this comes from his time teaching history and political science at Spelman College in Atlanta during the late 1950s and early 1960s. For some context for the listener, Spelman is a historically black women's college, but at that time it wasn't exactly known for radical activism.
No, it was very much designed as a finishing school.
Yeah.
The environment at Spelman during that era was defined by this strict, almost aristocratic gentility. Zinn describes the campus physically and psychologically as a fortress.
I like he called it a chastity belt, right?
Yes, he metaphorically refers to the massive stone wall and towering magnolia trees as a chastity belt meant to protect the young women from the harsh, violent, segregated reality of the Deep South outside.
They were trying to keep them safe.
Exactly. The goal of the institution, driven by its conservative administration and the protective instincts of older generations, was to teach these young black women to be polite, quiet, impeccably well-mannered, and above all, ladylike.
Right.
The prevailing survival advice handed down to them was simple. Just stay on campus, get your education, be respectable, and stay out of trouble.
But Zinn documents this incredible seismic psychological shift among the student body. These women completely rejected generations of protective advice to just be nice and avoid conflict.
They realized it wasn't working.
Right. They realized that their impeccable manners weren't going to dismantle Jim Crow, so they started leaving that beautifully manicured, insulated campus, crossing through the Magnolia Wall, and intentionally causing trouble.
Which was incredibly dangerous.
Very. They picketed discriminatory supermarkets. They initiated the bus desegregation actions, like that young woman we talked about at the beginning of the deep dive, who faced down a man with a knife without blinking.
The sheer physical courage required to step outside that protective wall into a society backed by armed police and violent mobs is staggering.
Unbelievable courage.
And this individual defiance ultimately culminated in the heavily coordinated mass sit-ins of 1960 in Atlanta. The Spelman students didn't just wander into this. They collaborated meticulously with students from other Atlanta colleges. And they drafted a blistering manifesto called the Appeal for Human Rights.
Which the governor of Georgia immediately dismissed as anti-American propaganda, naturally.
Of course he did, because it threatened the order he oversaw. But the students didn't care. Shortly after publishing the appeal, they executed a massive simultaneous sit-in at 10 different segregated eating places across the city.
Just completely shutting it down.
Yes. The routine of daily segregation in Atlanta was suddenly shattered. 14 Spelman students were arrested. And Zinn notes the profound, almost cinematic irony of the aftermath here.
Oh, this is my favorite part.
They used their finishing school training while locked in a Southern jail. One Spelman honors student was photographed sitting behind bars, completely composed, quietly reading a book by C.S. Lewis. They made a conscious choice to embrace the physical indignity of a prison cell over the spiritual indignity of segregation.
It's such a powerful image. But Zinn doesn't just look at the polite, composed defiance of the Spelman students. He actually compares their strategic disruption to a much more rugged, raw group operating half a century earlier. The Wobblies.
Formerly known as the Industrial Workers of the World, around 1912.
Right.
If we apply this lens of disruption to the labor movement, the Wobblies are the perfect parallel, despite being culturally opposite to the Spelman students.
Yeah, they were very different culturally.
Very. But just as the young women in Atlanta rejected the submissive politeness expected of them by society, the Wobblies actively rejected the polite trade unionism of their era, which was dominated by the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL.
So let's unpack that dynamic for a second. Why was the AFL considered polite, and why was that a problem?
Well, the AFL was inherently conservative. They played by the rules of the capitalist system. They focused almost exclusively on organizing skilled, white, male workers, essentially the elite of the working class.
So they were leaving a lot of people out.
Most people out. And their strategy was incremental. Ask for a few more cents an hour, maybe a slightly shorter workday, and avoid rocking the boat. They really just wanted a seat at the table with the bosses.
But the Wobblies had a different view.
The Wobblies looked at that approach and saw a complete failure to address the massive crushing poverty of the industrial age. The Wobblies didn't want a seat at the table. They wanted to build a completely new table.
I love that.
They sought to organize everyone the AFL ignored. The unskilled factory hands, the recent immigrants who spoke dozens of different languages, women, minorities, and they demanded a fundamentally new society where workers actually owned the means of production.
And because their demands were so fundamental, their tactics obviously couldn't be polite negotiations in boardrooms. I mean, Zinn heavily documents their role in the Lawrence textile strike in Massachusetts in 1912.
Right, the bread and roses strike.
Yeah, and this wasn't some gentleman's disagreement. This was raw, brutal class warfare. You had 25,000 workers walking out in the dead of a freezing New England winter.
The conditions were horrific. People were literally starving.
Yeah, and at one point, to ensure their children wouldn't starve or freeze to death during the strike, the workers actually organized a train to send their kids to stay with sympathetic families in Philadelphia and New York.
Just to keep them alive.
Right. But when the mothers and children arrived at the Lawrence train station to leave, the local police, acting on behalf of the mill owners, descended on the station. They literally clubbed the mothers and dragged screaming children away to patrol wagons just to break the morale of the strike.
It's hard to even picture that. But that staggering brutality reveals the core of Zinn's thesis on why unpolite systemic disruption is necessary for change.
How so?
Zinn suggests that all institutions, whether it is a segregated city government in Atlanta or a massive textile monopoly in Massachusetts, rely entirely on the daily, unthinking cooperation of citizens. The machine only runs if the gears keep turning quietly.
So if you just go along with it, everything is fine.
Exactly. As long as you follow the rules, go to the back of the bus, or show up to the loom for starvation wages, the institution functions effortlessly, and the people in charge never have to think about you.
But when you stop cooperating...
When that routine is intentionally physically broken, whether by a quiet sit-in or a massive 25,000-person strike, it forces a crisis. It creates a situation that the people holding power can no longer ignore.
I understand the theory, but I have to push back on this a little bit because it's something I struggle with when looking at modern movements. Doesn't this kind of aggressive disruption risk alienating the exact public whose support the movement desperately needs?
That's the classic critique, yeah.
Right, because you look at historical footage of people blocking traffic or shutting down entire cities with strikes, and you see the immediate, visceral, hostile backlash from everyday people who are just trying to go to work or feed their families. So if a movement's goal is to win over the hearts and minds of the majority, why does Zinn argue this unpolite approach is effective when it seems to actively invite such a harsh, polarizing backlash?
That is the essential friction of all social movements, really.
Yeah.
And it cues up exactly how Zinn understands the mechanics of institutional power. We have to look at why that backlash happens, and more importantly, how the state reacts to it.
Okay, lay it out for me.
When citizens disrupt the status quo to demand their constitutional rights, the immediate instinct of the government at literally any level, from a local sheriff to the President of the United States, is not to pause, reflect, and say, you make a valid moral point about justice.
No, definitely not.
The immediate, overwhelming instinct of the state is to restore order.
So order takes precedence over justice.
Every single time. And that brings us to the incentive architecture of the state. How do governments balance the abstract demand for justice against the very real demands of order, political risk, and institutional stability?
That's where he talks about the Kennedy administration, right?
Yes. Zinn provides a really scathing critique of the Kennedy administration's handling of the civil rights campaigns in places like Albany, Georgia, and Hattiesburg, Mississippi, specifically to illustrate this architecture.
Okay, let's dig into Albany, Georgia first, because the civil rights movement there ran up against a police chief named Lori Pritchett. And he was dealing with hundreds of peaceful protesters, including a young black girl named Ola Mae Quarterman.
Right.
She was arrested for refusing to move to the back of a segregated bus. And when the driver told her to move, she famously told him that she had paid her damn 20 cents and she could sit wherever she wanted.
I love that quote. And Chief Pritchett's response to her and the hundreds of others was incredibly shrewd. Pritchett had actually studied the tactics of the civil rights movement. He knew that violent, racist outbursts from police played poorly on national television.
So he changed the optics.
Exactly. He didn't publicly claim he was arresting these hundreds of people to uphold white supremacy or racial segregation. He stripped the racial rhetoric from his actions entirely. He claimed he was simply maintaining law and order.
The classic administrative excuse.
Right. He argued that the protesters were creating a public disturbance, and he was just stepping in to prevent violence and keep the streets clear. This seemingly neutral administrative rhetorical trick gave the federal government the exact excuse it needed to just look the other way.
Which is mind-blowing when you think about the scale of what was actually happening. I mean, the Kennedy administration, the Justice Department, and the FBI did absolutely nothing to intervene in Albany.
Nothing at all.
You had thousands of American citizens being thrown into overcrowded, filthy jails for the crime of praying in front of City Hall or sitting quietly in a public library. These are blatant, unquestionable violations of the First and 14th Amendments. The constitutional scoreboard is flashing red. But the federal government just stood on the sidelines and watched.
It wasn't just that they passively watched. It was that they possessed the explicit legal authority to intervene and made a conscious, calculated choice not to.
Wait, they had a specific law for this?
Yes. Zinn points out that this wasn't some gray area in the law. There was a statute on the books dating back to 1866 known as Section 242 of the U.S. Criminal Code. That law made it a federal crime for local officials, acting under the color of law, to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights.
Wow, so it was already illegal for Pritchett to do that.
It's exactly. But when civil rights leaders begged the Justice Department to use Section 242 to arrest Chief Pritchett and other local officials, the federal government refused. The Justice Department claimed they could only prosecute in the most extreme, undeniable cases of police brutality, arguing they had to avoid upsetting the delicate balance of federalism and states' rights.
But that excuse completely falls apart when you look at the cases where extreme, undeniable brutality did occur, because the federal government didn't intervene then either.
No, they didn't.
Look at what happened in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Zinn meticulously details the story of Oscar Chase, this young civil rights worker organizing with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Such a brutal story.
It really is. Chase gets pulled over and arrested on a completely fabricated traffic charge. They throw him in a local jail cell, and the police intentionally orchestrate a beating. They place a violent white ex-paratrooper into the cell with him.
Just unbelievable.
And this man proceeds to beat Oscar Chase mercilessly, leaving him bloody and unconscious on the floor, while the local police literally stand outside the cell bars, just watching and laughing.
A clear, violent deprivation of constitutional rights under the color of law. And what was the FBI's response when they were finally notified?
The FBI showed up the next day, but they didn't arrest the officers. They didn't arrest the ex-paratrooper. They walked into the cell, took some photographs of Oscar Chase's smashed, unrecognizable face, wrote down some notes in a ledger, and walked out.
It's sickening.
They acted as archivists of the brutality, not preventers of it. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. You're just going to sit there and take notes.
Yeah, they were basically just taking inventory. And this is the hidden system of institutional responsiveness that Zinn is really trying to expose. Why does the federal government, equipped with immense power and clear legal statutes, move so agonizingly slowly to protect its most marginalized citizens?
Why do you think?
Well, Zinn argues it has nothing to do with the law and everything to do with the incentive architecture of power. Politicians and federal bureaucrats are driven by a specific calculus: winning elections, maintaining bureaucratic caution, and a deep, systemic desire to preserve institutional stability.
Right, they don't want to rock the boat politically.
Exactly. For the Kennedy administration in the early 1960s, aggressively intervening in the South meant alienating the powerful bloc of Southern white Democratic voters and senators whose support John F. Kennedy desperately needed for his legislative agenda and his reelection.
So it's pure political math.
Yes. The government prioritizes order, which in this context simply means the absence of visible, chaotic, politically damaging conflict.
Over actual justice.
Yes, over justice, which would require actively fighting local authorities and enforcing constitutional rights against fierce resistance. So Zinn concludes that a liberal government is inherently a minimum government.
Meaning they do the bare minimum.
Precisely. It will not act out of a proactive moral imperative. It will only react, and it will only exert the absolute minimum effort required when the pressure from the streets becomes so overwhelming that continued inaction is more politically costly than action.
But wait, I have to stop you here because I see a massive structural contradiction in Zinn's argument.
Well, let's hear it.
If the FBI starts acting the way Zinn wants them to, I mean, if they stop being an investigative body that takes notes and they become a national police force that swoops into local towns, bypasses the local sheriff, and starts making arrests on the spot based on federal mandates, doesn't that create the exact kind of centralized authoritarian state that Zinn is famously terrified of?
There is a very fair point.
Right. How does someone who is so deeply skeptical of state power advocate for handing the federal government a specialized strike force? Who watches the watchers in that scenario?
That is a brilliant structural critique, and it really goes right to the heart of the tension in American federalism. Zinn acknowledges the danger of a sprawling, unchecked national police force. But his counterargument is that the federal government was already failing to observe the constitutional balance just in the other direction.
How so?
He argues that the 14th Amendment was passed after the Civil War specifically to allow the national government to restrain local tyranny. Leaving marginalized people to the mercy of violently racist local sheriffs isn't a check on tyranny, it is the endorsement of it.
So how does he propose fixing it without creating a secret police?
To thread that needle, Zinn called for the creation of a specialized armed federal defender force whose sole hyper-specific mandate was the protection of civil rights.
So they wouldn't do anything else.
Exactly. They wouldn't be a general police force investigating bank robberies or drug crimes. They would exist strictly to interpose themselves between local police and citizens attempting to exercise constitutional rights, like registering to vote or peacefully assembling.
Okay, so it's very targeted.
Right. If a local official violated federal law, this force would make immediate arrests. He believed that when local power becomes tyrannical and violently deprives citizens of their humanity, you have to use centralized power defensively to protect individual liberty. It's a risky balance, but he viewed it as the only mechanism to break the deadlock of local oppression.
Okay, so if we zoom out, we have a state whose initial reaction is almost always to maintain order. They do this either through calculated neglect, like the FBI merely taking notes on a beating, or through outright repression, like the police clubbing mothers at the Lawrence train station.
Right.
But if the institution's natural resting state is to crush or ignore disruption, how does meaningful change ever actually break through? Zinn says it relies on two incredibly powerful feedback loops.
Yeah, let's trace the mechanics of these two feedback loops, because this is really the engine of social change in Zinn's model. This is how movements survive state resistance, and conversely, how institutions attempt to neutralize those movements without actually changing the underlying power structure.
Okay, so what is loop one?
Loop one is the phenomenon where repression actually increases mobilization.
Explain how that works, because logically, if the local police beat Oscar Chase to a pulp, or if 14 Spelman girls are thrown into a filthy jail, that should terrify people. It should kill the movement. But Zinn argues it does the exact opposite.
It does the opposite because it exposes the violence inherent in the status quo.
Yeah.
When peaceful people are subjected to brutal, disproportionate repression, it strips away the illusion of polite society. It increases visibility, and it galvanizes solidarity.
Because everyone can see what's really happening.
Think about it. A polite request to integrate a lunch counter is easy for the national media to ignore. But 14 well-dressed college women being hauled off to jail, or peaceful marchers being attacked with fire hoses and police dogs, that creates inescapable visual evidence of injustice. It forces the national and sometimes international media to pay attention.
And that media attention changes the political math for the politicians.
Exactly. That visibility generates widespread national outrage, and suddenly the incentive architecture in Washington shifts. Before the repression, the political cost of acting was too high for the president.
Oh, once the pictures are everywhere.
Right, once the brutal images are on the front page of every newspaper, the political cost of inaction, of looking weak, hypocritical, or complicit in barbarism in front of the whole world, becomes much higher than the political cost of alienating the Southern segregationists or the mill owners.
So the state's attempt to repress the movement actually feeds its momentum and forces the federal government's hand.
Exactly.
But then we hit loop two, which I honestly find almost more insidious than the outright repression. Loop two is where concessions reduce mobilization. So the pressure gets too hot, the boiler's about to explode, the institution finally yields, they pass a law.
And everyone goes home happy.
Yeah.
Right.
Right, but Zinn points out that this concession acts as a trap. It absorbs the movement's radical energy. The activists cheer, they go home thinking they have fundamentally won, and that allows the deeper underlying structures of inequality to remain completely intact.
The quintessential example Zinn uses for this demobilizing concession is Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. Now, if you think back to how we are taught history, the New Deal is usually presented as this magnificent, purely benevolent package of legislation.
Yeah, the ultimate blueprint from the wise leader.
Handed down by a compassionate, wealthy president to save the working class from the ravages of the Great Depression.
Right, FDR is the savior of the common man.
But Zinn argues that FDR was practically dragged into the New Deal by militant, overwhelming demands from below. The 1930s were chaotic. You had massive unemployed councils taking over city buildings. You had sprawling groups of furious tenant farmers.
There was real danger of a revolution.
Absolutely. You had millions of workers launching general strikes that paralyzed entire cities like San Francisco and Minneapolis. The capitalist system wasn't just struggling, it was facing a legitimate, organized, existential threat from a population that had nothing left to lose.
So the government had to do something drastic.
So the government provided a massive concession to restore order, the New Deal reforms. They instituted Social Security, minimum wage laws, and labor protections. But Zinn asks us to look very closely at who was intentionally carved out of that legislation.
Yeah, the exclusions are glaring once you look for them. The New Deal left out roughly 9 million unemployed people. And crucially, it entirely excluded domestic workers and farm workers from the most critical benefits, like Social Security and minimum wage protections.
And if you look at the demographics of the 1930s, who made up the vast majority of domestic servants and agricultural laborers.
Black Americans and marginalized immigrants.
And why were they excluded? It wasn't just some administrative oversight. They were excluded to appease the powerful bloc of Southern Democrats in Congress, whose votes FDR absolutely needed to pass the legislation.
So he traded their rights for votes.
Yes. The Southern politicians refused to support any federal law that might threaten the cheap labor force that underpinned the segregated Southern economy. So the New Deal concession was brilliant from the state's perspective. It provided just enough of a safety net for the white working class to save the capitalist system from revolution. But it absorbed and diffused the radical energy of the labor movement while leaving the deep structures of racial and economic inequality completely untouched.
That really makes me think of a pressure valve on a massive steam engine.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, like the institution, the federal government feels the pressure building up inside the boiler from all these disparate movements, the strikes, the sit-ins, the unemployed councils.
Right.
If the government does nothing and keeps the valve shut, the boiler eventually explodes, you know. You get an actual revolution. So the government calculates exactly how much they need to slightly open the pressure valve. They release just enough steam, they pass the Wagner Act, they pass the Civil Rights Act to bring the needle out of the red zone and prevent the whole machine from blowing up.
Just enough to relieve the pressure.
Right. The politicians point to the gauge. They say, look, we fixed the pressure. The public goes home satisfied. But here's the kicker. They never actually turn off the fire that is heating the boiler in the first place. The fundamental systemic issues of exploitation are still burning just as hot.
That analogy perfectly captures Zinn's understanding of institutional behavior. The state utilizes its immense power to maintain the status quo, and it only yields the absolute minimum concession required when forced by external pressure.
It's all about self-preservation.
Right. Now, if we take this structural tension, this prioritization of order and institutional stability over pure justice, and we apply it internationally, we begin to see how Zinn evaluates the state's projection of power globally. How does a state that is so reluctant to protect rights at home behave when it projects military force abroad?
That brings us to a much darker application of Zinn's mental model, the moral calculus of state violence and war, because he applies this exact same skeptical framework to foreign policy, specifically looking at the Vietnam War and the post-9/11 war on terror.
Right, and Zinn was actually a bombardier in World War II, so he speaks from experience.
Exactly. He proposes a highly rigorous set of 4 tests to evaluate whether any use of military violence can be morally justified. He frames this as distinguishing the surgeons from the butchers.
It is a really demanding moral calculus. For any violence or armed struggle to be considered justified, Zinn argues it must pass all 4 of these specific tests without exception.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, is the violence a case of true self-defense against a clear outside attacker, or defense against a tyrannical internal force? Second, is it a genuine indigenous revolution against deep oppression, relying on local manpower rather than being orchestrated by outside puppet forces?
And the third?
Third, is the violence strictly surgically focused on the evildoers, meaning there are absolutely no innocent civilian targets? And fourth, is the ultimate cost of the violence, measured in human suffering, destruction, and the risk of a wider war, proportionate to the political or moral goal being achieved.
Okay, so let's apply this incredibly strict test to Vietnam. Zinn argues that the United States failed these tests spectacularly. To start, he points out that the Viet Cong Rebellion was a legitimate indigenous rebellion by a local peasant population against a corrupt, oppressive dictatorship in South Vietnam.
It was their own country.
Right. It was not a case of outside aggression by an invading foreign army, which is exactly how the U.S. government framed it to the American public to justify the intervention.
Yes. Zinn spends a lot of time dismantling the rhetoric used to sell the war. He heavily criticizes what policymakers called the Munich analogy.
Oh, I've heard of this.
Throughout the Cold War, U.S. officials constantly justified military interventions, especially in Vietnam, by saying, if we don't stop them here, it will be just like appeasing Hitler at Munich in 1938. The dominoes will fall.
But Zinn says that's a false equivalent, right?
Exactly. Zinn argues this was a completely false, manipulative narrative. At Munich, you had a massive, external, aggressive military power, Nazi Germany, invading a peaceful, democratic neighboring country, Czechoslovakia.
Very clear-cut.
Right. But in Vietnam, you had a local, impoverished peasant population rebelling against a deeply unpopular U.S.-backed dictatorship in their own country. By continually leaning on the Munich analogy, the U.S. government terrified the public and justified horrific, indiscriminate violence, like the saturation bombing of rural farming villages with napalm, under the grand, noble guise of stopping global communist conquest.
And he brings the same intense, unforgiving critique to the post-9/11 wars, particularly the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. He wrote an essay titled The Others, where he highlights the massive scale of civilian suffering that is totally obscured from the American public by sanitized, bureaucratic Pentagon language.
It's a really tough read.
It really is. He contrasts how the U.S. media treated the victims of the 9/11 attacks with how they treated the victims of U.S. bombing in Afghanistan. After 9/11, the New York Times ran deeply humanized, detailed obituaries for the victims. We learned about their hobbies, their children, their favorite sports teams.
It made the tragedy visceral and real for everyone reading.
Exactly. But the victims of the U.S. retaliation in Afghanistan were completely invisible. They were just numbers.
The contrast in how we value human life is devastating. Zinn painstakingly combed through foreign press reports to put human faces and names to the statistics that the U.S. government was ignoring.
Yeah, he found some really heartbreaking stories.
He did. The source material highlights one incredibly specific, tragic example that Zinn documented to break through this apathy. A 10-year-old Afghan boy named Noor Mohammed. This child lost his hands and his eyes to a U.S. bomb, and he wasn't near a battlefield. He was simply sitting down eating Sunday dinner with his family when their home was destroyed.
It's horrible.
His father was killed in the blast. 6 of his siblings were injured, including one who was left in a coma. Zinn points out that when the Pentagon is pressed by reporters on horrific incidents like the blinding of Noor Mohammed, they don't use humanizing language.
Yeah, they use sterile jargon.
They retreat into clinical anesthetized terms like collateral damage, or they justify the strike by saying they were targeting vaguely defined military targets in the area.
I have to pause here and ask you, the listener, to really think about the implications of this. If we apply Zinn's 4 tests rigorously to modern conflict, especially that third test, which demands that violence must be strictly focused on the evildoers and cannot target or kill innocents, is it even possible for any modern industrialized war to be justified?
It's a very challenging question.
Given the absolute inevitability of civilian casualties in the age of high-altitude aerial bombing, drone strikes, and long-range artillery, doesn't Zinn's framework basically render modern warfare inherently, inescapably immoral?
That is exactly the uncomfortable conclusion Zinn guides his readers toward. He argues that the very nature of modern technological warfare, with its massive, indiscriminate destructive power, makes it physically impossible to distinguish the guilty from the innocent in practice.
So it always fails the test.
Therefore, it automatically fails the test of focused violence. You cannot drop a 500-pound bomb on a neighborhood and claim you only intended to kill the insurgent. Furthermore, Zinn uses this to highlight a massive hypocrisy in state power.
Oh, this is the big one.
He argues that the state is incredibly willing to unleash massive, unchecked power, vast amounts of taxpayer money, and devastating violence when it comes to military intervention abroad, always justified by a high-minded rhetoric about defending freedom or restoring order.
Which brings up a massive, glaring contradiction that ties this whole deep dive together, because how does that immense willingness to intervene and spend trillions of dollars abroad compare to the government's willingness to intervene in the economy at home to help its own citizens?
This is where Zinn brings all of his arguments about the Constitution, about disruption, about state incentives, together into one cohesive critique. Let's look at economic power and the enduring myth of the free market, specifically focusing on his essay analyzing the 2008 financial crisis, titled A Big Government Bailout.
This essay is so clarifying because you see the exact same rhetorical tricks being used. When marginalized citizens like the unemployed or families going bankrupt because they don't have health care or people facing eviction.
When they organize and ask for their rights or ask for economic help.
Right. Government officials suddenly become strict constitutionalists. They start citing the virtues of rugged individualism. They warn the public about the terrifying slippery slope of big government and socialism. They solemnly declare that the free market is a law of nature and must be allowed to operate without government interference, even if people suffer.
Yet Zinn observes that when the authority, the economic interests, or the institutional stability of the wealthy elite are threatened, that rugged free market philosophy disappears overnight. It vanishes.
They completely forget about it.
When the entire financial system collapsed in 2008 due to unregulated speculation, the government didn't lecture Wall Street about rugged individualism. They acted with breathtaking speed and legislative efficiency.
They found the money real fast.
They quickly authorized a $700 billion taxpayer bailout for the exact Wall Street institutions that caused the crash institutions. That Zinn notes were notable primarily for their incompetence and greed. Suddenly, the terrifying specter of big government was embraced as the only logical solution to save the economy.
And what's fascinating is that Zinn doesn't just treat 2008 as an anomaly. He traces this exact contradiction all the way back to the very foundation of the country, back to the Founding Fathers.
He does. He completely shatters the myth that the Founding Fathers wanted a small, weak government. He points out that the Constitution itself was designed in large part to create a big government capable of projecting massive power to put down domestic rebellions by the poor.
Like Shays' Rebellion.
Right, exactly. He cites Shays' Rebellion in 1786. You had poor Revolutionary War veterans and farmers in Massachusetts who were facing brutal foreclosures and crushing debt from wealthy merchants. They took up arms to prevent the courts from seizing their family farms.
So they were fighting for their livelihoods.
Yes. And the wealthy elite, including the Founding Fathers, realized that a weak, decentralized government couldn't protect their property from the demands of the desperate masses. So they drafted the Constitution to create a strong, centralized federal apparatus specifically to protect elite property rights and maintain economic order.
He also uses a brilliant historical example from the late 19th century involving President Grover Cleveland. There was a massive, devastating drought in Texas, and thousands of farmers were literally starving to death.
Just a terrible situation.
Congress, seeing the desperation, passed a very modest bill to give these farmers a mere $10,000 for seed grain just so they could survive the winter and plant a new crop. But President Cleveland vetoed the bill.
And his excuse was incredible.
Right. He justified letting them starve by saying that federal aid weakens the sturdiness of our national character. But Zinn points out that in that exact same year, Cleveland used a massive government surplus to pay off wealthy bondholders at a premium, handing them a pure taxpayer gift of $5 million. Where was the concern for their sturdiness of character?
It ruthlessly exposes the absolute myth of the free market. Zinn's historical documentation proves that the United States government has always been a big government that heavily subsidizes big business. From handing out massive, continent-spanning land grants to the railroad monopolies in the 19th century to the multi-billion-dollar corporate welfare and bailouts of today, the state constantly intervenes to protect capital. Wow. But it preaches the harsh gospel of rugged individualism and free market discipline only to the poor and the working class.
It is the ultimate structural irony. When you look at the system through Zinn's lens, you realize that capitalism and the unforgiving Darwinian rules of the free market are strictly enforced for the poor. But socialism, endless bailouts, and a giant taxpayer-funded safety net are instantly provided for the rich the moment they get into trouble.
If we pull all the way back and bring all of these disparate threads together, from the young women at Spelman College shattering the polite rules of segregation in Atlanta to the Wobblies braving police batons in the snow of Massachusetts.
From the tragedy of a blinded child in a peasant village in Afghanistan to the Wall Street executives demanding $1 billion bailout in Washington.
We are forced to confront the overarching picture of how we perceive rights and power in our society.
So, after digging through all of this history, we have to ask the central question of this show. What is the crisis in perception here?
The crisis in perception is our deeply ingrained, almost mythological belief that our rights, our liberties, and our democratic progress are gifts granted to us from above by benevolent leaders, wise judges, and formal documents.
Right, that top-down narrative.
What Zinn's historical lens reveals is that this top-down narrative is an illusion. What appears to be a history of rights generously granted from the halls of power is actually a history of organized disruptive people forcing the issue. They changed the political cost of refusing those rights until the institutions had no choice but to concede.
So the documents don't do it alone.
Formal institutions and paper constitutions certainly matter. They are the scoreboard. But they are entirely hollow without the friction of public enforcement.
To resolve the question we started with, why do rights that exist on paper so often remain unreal? Because rights are not self-executing. Their practical meaning, their actual existence in your daily life, depends entirely on power, enforcement, participation, and sustained, organized public pressure.
The scoreboard never changes its own numbers.
The score only changes when the players on the field force it to change.
Exactly. Zinn's deeper, enduring challenge to us is to recognize the structural reality of the state. Institutional power, by its very nature and incentive architecture, will almost always prioritize order, stability, and the status quo over true justice. Therefore, if we want justice, if we want those paper rights to mean something, we cannot wait patiently for the institution to initiate it.
It forces us to ask a deeply personal question. It asks you, the listener, to consider not only what rights our society formally recognizes on paper in a glass case in Washington, but what daily, active, sometimes unpolite mechanisms you are participating in to make those rights real, durable, and felt in your community. If rights rust when left out in the reign of complacency, what are you doing to keep yours polished?
That is the essential question left for us to answer.
Crisis in perception is not about telling people what to think. It is about making the systems shaping perception more visible. Because when structural forces remain hidden, meaningful change becomes far more difficult to imagine. Every book is more than a collection of facts. It's a lens through which we can examine the systems shaping our world. Whether today's investigation challenged what you thought you knew or simply encouraged you to ask better questions, the goal remains the same. To think critically, follow the evidence, and remain open to changing your mind when the facts lead somewhere unexpected. Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. Until next time, stay curious, keep questioning, and learn to spot the crisis in perception. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, share, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.